Okay. So, yeah, welcome to the first live Q&A. I'm Ryan, and I have one question ready. We'll get into in a minute. Before that, though, just settling into the present moment. You can notice your breathing. Maybe noticing the sounds surrounding us. What do you hear in this moment? So, this question. It's funny. I saw this question last night, and I was being mindful, though, not to let my mind plan what I was going to say, because um, something I wish to practice or to share to teach is just showing up in presence, and then trusting presence to, I guess, act, to come out most effectively, whether it's answering questions or just in daily life. A lot of my presence practice is very simple, just doing the dishes uh, quietly, peacefully, or uh, driving, doing my best to drive with other humans around and not be reactive or impatient, or all these type of things. Um, but right now, it's also just sharing my experience, and which comes with a lot of peace. Really, it's one of the main intentions of presence, of spiritual awakening, finding peace. But well, actually, before I can go into that question, we can look at peace for a moment. Uh, just asking, pausing, and listening inward, noticing, do you feel at peace right now in this moment? Is there peace? What are you feeling? And if there is peace, well, great. Then you just enjoy it. Uh, if there's some flavor of non peace, though, that's okay too. Then you just become aware of it and be present with it, breathe through it. Or a different way of approaching this as well is Eckhart invites a question: am I at ease in this moment? Is there ease? And it's just an honest yes or no. And if there is ease, then you enjoy. If there is not ease, then that's where I kind of look at it as practice in various ways. Also, the degree of peace that we feel is one of the very effective ways to measure our spiritual progress. Uh, because in spirituality, there's tons of philosophies, far out concepts, and very interesting things to think about. Very, you might even call it complex things to think about, and all of that's nice. But what I've come to really feel is it's only worth as much as my own inner state of freedom and equanimity. If I have all these elaborate spiritual ideas, but internally I'm just suffering all the time, anger and fear and sadness and all these things, then something's missing. Uh, and that's where a lot of my practice is focused on uh, finding the peace, and then really mastering living in the peace, protecting the peace, and doing my best to have every action come from it. From the feeling, though, not the idea of being peaceful, but the actual feeling of it. Just the hard part. But it's also the tremendous gift. The more we do find this peace, it's just a powerful gift to ourselves and to those around us. Because the more we're at peace, the more naturally we just are, mm, you know, more enjoyable to be around. Uh, Less we're judging those around us and all that kind of jazz. Okay, now let's jump into this question. So the question from Luna: How do you deal with all the crazy news recently? Oh, starting off this my whole Q&A and everything with the big question. Yeah. Okay, how do I deal with the crazy news? Well, uh, one thing for me, it's coming up. The news is always crazy. It has been for as long as I've ever seen it. the the intensity of it, where our focus goes, whether it's like something happening in the country I live in or some other country somewhere else, or all these different things, that shifts. But the fact that the news always is something crazy going on with humans, and oftentimes just very intense, very like violence and it's various aspects of insanity. And so how I deal with it, I don't ignore the news. If that's what's part of what's happening on the world, okay, then I see it. Yeah, I just see it for what it is. Uh, One of the most important things, I guess you could say, I do to deal with it, though, is self-observation. Just watching my inner space, how what I'm thinking and how I'm feeling as I'm observing the news. Um, and actually, Eckhart just recently, I heard a talk from him talking about how you can approach the news as a spiritual practice, observing news as spiritual practice, but he referred to it as a particularly advanced practice because it's so charged, and because whether politically, no matter what side you might be on, just the conversation of politics, very charged, very easy for the ego, our identity, to fall into a sort of ego about political opinions or uh, or all kinds of stuff that that you see on the news. And so it's a deep practice to be able to hold space for this type of news without uh, getting swept away in it all, because it's very easy to get swept away. um, so that's and so in this sense too, I don't particularly go looking for the news, but I do find that it finds me. It's if you're just on social media a little bit, the news finds you, especially the big stuff. You can't escape the news. uh, if it's a particularly big subject, I'll look into it a little bit, just to see it. But I don't know, at the same time, um, when I see the chaos happening in humanity, well, for one, the news is kind of unfortunately fallen into a pattern of sensationalism, right? Where it's always just showing us like the busiest stuff, the most chaotic stuff gets the biggest headline, right? Draws the most attention, it's the most exciting. Uh, and unfortunately, too, with the human ego and pain body, we can have a part of us that actually feeds on drama. And I think the news outlets have actually unknowingly moved to fill that role of, here's your daily dose of drama and your daily dose of pain and craziness of other humans, which it would be nice to bring in a little more positive news at times too. Not that we could only have positive. I think it's important to be aware of everything that's happening, but we can overdo it in that awareness. So self observation, noticing how I'm feeling, what thoughts are arising through it all. And a lot of times, I mean, when you're looking at the details of the news, I find it really comes back to seeing and forgiving the ego that humans have. Because most of the insanity that we see in the news, and whatever flavor it might be, wherever it is in the world, it's almost always a byproduct of the human ego. And uh, because that's just what the ego does. Its own nature is an insanity, and so it just spreads that. And a powerful thing to do when we're observing the ego out in the world, though, is to turn it back inward in mirroring ourselves. Um, like what in me might do that thing that we're judging in the other. Um, Maybe not to the same scale, of course, but still, I've learned a lot from first being annoyed by someone else's ego, and then looking inward and looking at my own annoyance, looking at my own reactions, my own mental judgments, and realizing where um, my own ego was still at play. And those are humbling moments, but they're very powerful because something also actually that I find beautiful, if you can hold space for the news, is that when we can hold space and observe the chaos out in the world, um, and yet still find a sense of peace, it's it actually is helping the collective. We're connected to the world. I mean, we are part of the world, and the world is part of us. Uh, we're not as separate as often we initially believe. Um, and so, in a sense, we're connected to the craziness is connected to us, but vice versa too. The more I can deepen my own experience of peace and presence and or state of consciousness, if I can raise my state of consciousness, well, I'm connected to the collective, I'm connected to others. So it's also raising the collective out, out there that we see on the news. And um, I think this is one of the main things that we run into when we watch the news a lot. All the crazy stuff is like it becomes very sort of defeating of what what's wrong with the world and what can I do to help it. And especially when you look everywhere, there's so much a mess. It's like where do I even start? And that's where I really feel we start with ourselves. We clean up our own little messes. We tend to our own garden, our own inner space. And this, I really do feel, is the most effective thing I can do to help all that stuff out there. Just keep working on me, keep healing my stuff, keep working with my reactivities, my ego hangups, and all that jazz. And it heals. It heals, uh, especially just the people around us, of course. But then you can play with the idea of the more far out that we're all connected on an energetic level, and so the more my energy increases, the more it actually elevates the collective, and the more humans as a whole, as the collective continues awakening, healing, evolving, uh, the news insanity will become less and less, uh, which will be really nice. The news might become more boring. We won't have as much to 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 uh, to show, which will be great. It'd be great if the news became boring. uh, so this is ways that I look at the news. An interesting metaphor that I sometimes have been using lately, just about our own mind, though, is related to the news. Because you'll notice, I feel like newspapers are kind of a dying thing, but newspapers, uh, you'd have the headlines, right? And the biggest headline, the biggest pull to, oh, you should read this newspaper, right? It's usually the most exciting, sensational. Um, it's the big thing, and then there are other ones in the paper, though. There are other little my sub headlines of other things, events happening, and so on. One thing I noticed about my mind and how our mind tends to work is it always has those headlines going on in our own head of our own stuff, what our current headlines are of our own dramas, the big problems that are waiting to be resolved, the big dramas, the difficult person, whatever. And um, it was helpful to notice this because of the reality of like that never ends. We get all caught up in whatever the thing is that we're so caught up in our current, life experience. And then you fast forward a week or month or whatever, every problem eventually solves itself or some way or another comes to an end. But then another one comes in. It takes that space. And uh, if you can see that though, it's helpful, uh, because you can kind of spot an illusion in it. Like there it, the opportunity for there to be this big, loud, bold headline is always there. But what if Um, what if we didn't give it so much drama, so much of our attention, so much of our daily experience, like carrying these problems around with us all the time? And instead, like I guess we could say with my practice, I don't ignore problems. You can't ignore. You can't just ignore them. They'll just wait there for you until you deal with them. But but I do surrender problems. Problem arises, which could become a big headline in my head of this thing is such a pain in the ass, but instead I surrender it. Okay, this is happening. There's acceptance and then surrender, and I might it gently look at how I could solve it for a little bit, but then I put it down, which means putting it down mentally. I just put it down and become one way you do that, become more present. Notice the breath, notice the sounds. Uh, get out of the head, which is where all the headlines and the stories circulate. Become more present, and then in being present, I can be at peace. Everything's fine. No problem right now. Literally, just in this moment, is there a problem? For me, no. Space is quiet. You here watching this seem peaceful and no problems. There's no trolls. no, no problems. Uh, so it's also really nice to part of the gift of becoming present is actually remembering and noticing. Oh, right now there's no problem. Can I feel that? Can I let myself feel that peace of not carrying a headline around all the time, a newspaper of problems. Um, let's see what else. There was another thing, but now it's escaping me. One aspect of the whole newspaper metaphor, one of the way that we create a lot of unnecessary problems, or we might say we inflate them, we kind of milk them for all the drama. One of the ways we do this is through resisting that situation, and ultimately just resisting the present moment, resisting life. Uh, we say no to it. Something happens, and something in us immediately just goes, no, no, this light should not be taking this long. No, that person shouldn't have done that thing, and so on. And whenever we say no, uh, well, there's suffering for one, because that feeling of no, the feeling of resisting what is, if you look at it closely, it's not pleasant. It's a constriction, it's like a stress, or if the no is very strong, it can be an anger. Um, it's not a pleasant feeling. And when compared to peace, uh, not pleasant at all. So, something within the aspect of integrating our spiritual practice is being very flexible with life. Whatever happens in this moment, just being able to go with it. There's that cliche statement, go with the flow. Well, it's very profound, actually. If we really understood go with the flow, that's basically enlightenment. Just go with what's happening. And then something happens and you're like, whoa, wasn't expecting that, but it's happening. Okay. This is what's happening then. The more you can really adapt with what's occurring in the moment, uh, the more we can really be at ease, and just keep floating. Yeah. The funny thing about that though is it's a lot easier said than done. It sounds nice and like okay, and then but then this video ends and we go about our life and sometimes it's the littlest things that can get you. You just I don't know, you drop some food and it lands on the ground. And just no, there's a little resistance there, and then somebody says something that you disagree with, and oh no, I no, that's wrong, and these little no's just start to add up. Um, and it's taken me years of practice to feel like the ability to genuinely just say okay and yes to life is sustained. Yeah, but it's very freeing. So let's see what's next to talk about. That was my only question to answer, so that's nice. uh, there's always so much to talk about, really, though. Ironically, about since much of spiritual awakening is really waking up out of the mind, out of this rascally thinking mind, which is almost always just churning around thoughts, thoughts, thoughts. And Eckhart puts it spiritual awakening is awakening out of the dream of thinking. Um, for much of my life, I didn't realize I was in a dream of thinking. Uh, the thoughts were happening. And what's strange is the thoughts were happening. I remember the thoughts were happening in me, and they would directly affect my experience of life, but I wasn't aware of them. Like for years, I had this fear of my partner cheating on me, and it would drive me crazy. These little thoughts, these little fearful, imaginary thoughts of you know. But if you had asked me, what are you thinking about? I honestly couldn't tell you. I was not at all aware that these little thoughts were going. But they were creating a lot of suffering, a lot of fear, even anger. I find myself in a real irritable mood. And then, my partner would yell, get upset or be like, why are you angry? And I didn't even know. I had no clue that it was connected to these thoughts of fear. And that's one of the strange things about waking up out of the dream of thought is initially, before awakenings happened, we don't realize we're in this dream. And actually, when the dream goes completely without awareness, it can turn into quite a nightmare. Uh, it's not a pleasant dream, lots of suffering. Um, but in my own experience, the suffering built up to a point where, like, a bit of the ego just collapsed. Uh, and suddenly I became more aware of what's going on in my head throughout the day. What am I thinking about? Uh, and and then also noticing, wow, what I'm thinking about really plays a large part in how I'm experiencing life, how I'm experiencing this moment. If I'm thinking, which also includes interpretation, an event happens, how I experience it very much can depend on how I interpret it. And the interpretation happens in thought, the mind coming in saying, oh, it's, a lot of times it's assumptions or it's like guesses of someone else's intention. Maybe I guess someone's intention was malevolent, and then that gets me more worked up. And then I get wrapped up in this whole mental story uh, that isn't even actually true. But in my mind, it's just been, I'm experiencing all this anger and stress and suffering. And uh, what would happen if suddenly the mind just went, whoop, just the mind went quiet? Well, the funny thing is, I found if you can access a moment of no thought, it gives this clarity to the situations that we're experiencing, because it's like seeing above the clouds. When you're under the clouds, you're just subject to the weather. If it's rainy or whatever, uh, and you're in an airplane, and you break out over the clouds, and then it's actually a beautiful sunny day. Under you, there's still rain and storm, but now you're above it. And in a way, when you can step out of this raging river of thought, even for just a moment, it gives you that little brief view above the clouds to remember, oh, this is all just mind happening. What my experience, how I'm experiencing this moment is really based on these clouds of my thoughts in my mind. And uh, that's very important. Uh, so let's focus for a minute on this favorite subject of mine, quieting the mind. Uh, I've heard people say that they don't believe it's possible to quiet the mind, and probably because in their experience they haven't experienced it yet. So, okay, that's just fine. Interestingly, though, the idea, the thought that says, the belief that says it's not possible, well, that's just another thought. It might be a very strong thought, a very convincing thought, but it's actually just another thought. Uh, and so, in this moment, though, let's just invite inward. It's almost a meditation of sorts. You don't have to sit with your eyes closed in lotus position. You just have to notice what's going through your mind right now as you're hearing me. Maybe you're thinking about things that I've been talking about. It's also possible that your mind has drifted completely elsewhere. You haven't heard much of what I've said at all, which is okay. This happens too. Um, but just notice, where is the mind right now? What am I thinking about? So that's the first step, just noticing, bringing awareness to what thought is occurring. The next step is, well, noticing what thought is occurring, and then there's actually different ways to come to the space of no mind, the space of no thought. One of them is so first you're noticing the thought, then notice the noticer, the part of you that is aware of the thought is not made of thought. It is your presence. uh, Another nice term, choiceless awareness. It's unbiased too. It doesn't have opinions, doesn't have beliefs or attachments. It's just your pure awareness. It's noticing whatever the mind activity is. And so if you notice that, oh, and in that little moment of noticing, you might find the mind slows down or subsides. Another way to taste the cessation of thought, you can ask yourself the question, I wonder what my next thought is going to be. And then it's just funny. It says, what's my next thought going to be? And in that moment of wondering, there is no thought. Right before that first thought comes in, when you ask again, I wonder what my next thought is going to be, and there's a moment of nothing, just quiet. And then if thought comes back in, though, then you just go back to the thought observation. You're noticing, oh, the mind, there it goes. rambling on again, changing subjects frequently. That's something I noticed about my mind in a lot of observation. It can change subjects very rapidly. At one moment, I'm thinking about meditating, and the next moment, I'm thinking about food, and the next moment, I'm thinking about the news, and all over the place. Uh, but then, in becoming still, uh, shining my awareness on the mind also becomes still. So that's another way to quiet the mind. A few other ways to do it is through very focused attention. Uh, if you focus your attention completely on some aspect of present moment, that's actually another way to step out of thought. They call it mindfulness. To be mindful is kind of a popular term nowadays, but it's like the mind is full is almost a misnomer because really mindfulness is also the space of Zen practice of mindlessness, but not a bad mindlessness. Uh, but in the view of the mindful, when you focus your attention completely on one part of present moment, you can allow the experience of that sort of stimulus to fully take up your attention. And the more our attention gets fully focused on just something of present moment, the less the mind has any need to wander into something else. So we can do this with any of the five senses. Um, say, for example, listening. One of my favorite practices is just listening to the sounds of present moment. But yeah, and one end you're hearing my voice and the talking, which has concepts and stuff. But also notice the sounds around you. They might be very subtle. The sound of a heater, even the sound of your own breathing. Very simple sounds. But if you give it your fullest attention, there's nothing that needs to be thought about right now. And you can do this with any of the five senses, though: the smell, taste, touch, and sight. Sight tends to be a little trickier because we're so used to having our eyes open and going about our day that to be able to look around without immediately labeling what we're seeing isn't is can be difficult, but it's very powerful when you can look around at an object, just any object, my eyeglass cleaner, and nothing particularly special about it. But if I give it my fullest attention, then my awareness is in present moment. And there's no, what do I need to think about in observing it? Children are great at this too, little ones, because there's also a sense of wonder when they're looking. Like, what is this? What is this really? Especially if I let go of my mental ideas of labeling this and knowing its purpose and so on. What I'm only seeing is the object itself. What I find when I really give a strong attention or presence to the present moment in any form, it becomes more beautiful. It's just it's hard to kind of explain, but it's like it becomes more HD, more vivid, more like just wow. And then actually, we can even practice this with humans, which is very powerful too, to be able to look at another human, whether uh, in our day-to-day surroundings or just a stranger that we cross paths with, but be able to look at someone in presence where no thinking about them, no thoughts, opinions, or anything, just a deep attention. And within this looking too, there's just a sort of a full allowing them to be just as they are. No need for them to be any different. No need for me to. No need for this pen that I'm looking at to be any different. It's just right as it is. And to be able to look, around in our daily life and to look at other people, a very beautiful practice to be able to see people without judgments, without the mind activity. Oh, something else very powerful when dealing with people. Uh, what's that quote? Hell is other people. uh, Spiritual practice, is one thing when we're just by ourselves in our own little cave or whatever, but it really becomes a mastery when we interact with everybody else. Because we're having to really, we're our egos clash with other people's egos, and there's all this mirroring and and all our judgments and reactivity and stuff bubbles up at different times. We come across just the right personality that gets us. um, it comes really how I see it is like it's a beautiful training ground to really sharpen our practice and to sharpen our mm, ability to skillfully live in peace uh, and to share that peace. Um, but one of the beautiful things that if you can find when interacting with other people um, is not to identify them with their past. Uh, when meeting somebody in present moment, there's just this moment of meeting them. So in a way, it's sort of letting go of all the conceptual ideas that we have attached to their past. This is harder to do with people that we have a lot of shared past with. Um, this is also why family, parents and children and so on, can be most difficult because there's a lot of shared past. So there's a strong temptation for the mind to identify that person with their past. Um, but when we can show up just in present, it's like a beautiful kind of refresh button, restart button. It's like I only see you as you're showing up now. That's all I know of you is how you're showing up right now, and uh, that's a beautiful thing. Also, very important with forgiving because oftentimes people, anyone in our past, we have all kinds of things, and then there's things that need to be forgiven uh, within ourselves, the resentments and the stuff that we need to forgive of the other. And so this is one way to do it. Actually, is to forgive, to drop the past, even to forgive the self. When we look at forgiving, it's not just forgiving everybody else; it's also forgiving ourselves, our own past. When I look in my past, sometimes I remember like how I used to drive, and it's so cringy. It's like, oh, why did I do that? I used to be such an aggressive, selfish driver. Uh, there's different things like that when I look in my past that I was not very conscious. I wasn't being wise or kind, and this was my ego was happening then, and I had to acknowledge that, but also forgive it. There's no need to feel shame or guilt because I can recognize that in that moment I was doing the best I could in that moment. Now I'm in this moment and I can see clearly what I was doing wrong there and I can be that change. And so that's done, lesson learned, moving on. It's kind of how it feels. Uh, but very important, self forgiveness. Also, self forgiveness is very important for when we slip. Even if you're actively now working on your practice, um, unless you're fully enlightened, you're going to slip. Uh, that's what part. This whole part of the journey is too. Is just slowly uh, deepening, so we slip less or less intensely, and then eventually maybe to a mastery level where the slips are very few and far in between, which is nice. But in the meantime, we have to work with our truth, the honest truth of how much do we slip in a day, which means how much do we become reactive? How often do we get lost in our judgments of others and impatience or anger or whatever the reactivity is in the body and in the mind? All these slips where we lose present moment. Um, this is okay in a way because we have to just see what is first. If it's very messy, okay, fine. But now you see your curriculum. Each slip is simply the curriculum where we can focus our attention on deepening, on healing, and so on. But what's interesting is we can't do that if we don't meet it first with forgiveness. Uh, because without forgiveness, we will deny our slips. We suppress them. It's a very strange thing, but the mind does this where it's like we do something out of the ego, and then we aren't even really able to admit that we did that thing. We just kind of want to drop it and move on. It's too painful to look at, kind of thing. And that's where the self forgiveness is important, because there's a sort of a humility and an accountability of like, oh, yeah, that happened. Okay. And now what? Now I look at it, I take responsibility for it, and I do my best to learn from it. But then drop the story. Then you can drop the story. Okay, now move on. Do your best next time the situation happens to handle it a little more skillfully, a little more mindfully. And in this process of forgiveness mixed with accountability, it happens, and we start to become less reactive, uh, less more peaceful, really, more embodied in the values that we want it. I think most humans, we have our ideas of our values, and everybody wants to live those values, but actually doing it can be very difficult. and and that's where this practice of self-awareness and also self-forgiveness, but at the same time accountability, uh, all mixed together, adds to a slow and steady progressing, what I also call healing. Uh, in my spiritual journey, in a lot of ways, I would call it just a slow healing process. Um, yeah, and everybody's got things to heal, you know. I mean, plus each of us were born into a world that was that much less conscious through our parents and through society and all the different experiences we've had. So every human on this planet right now has experienced some degree of unfairness due to the insanity of the ego outside of them. Wasn't their fault at all, but they just cards we get dealt, so to speak. And then we have to work with that, and we have to slowly work through healing these things. Um, and that's, I think, one of our main purposes in being here. I think, a big question that we often can come across is what's our purpose in this life and as humans and so on. And for me, it's this healing process. It's doing the best I can with what I've been given in this life, and tending to my own garden, being the change I wish to see. That lovely Gandhi wisdom. Uh, you see all that craziness out there. Okay, yeah, it's happening. But am I embodying the change? Yeah, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful that I'm not causing any of that chaotic mess that ends up on the news in my own life. I'm being pretty peaceful, but not perfect. Also important with the idea of making progress. It's not about perfection. It's just about little baby steps. Uh, those little steps add up, and then you end up with more and more of the gifts of the practice. But most important step, this step right now, this moment. What am I thinking? How am I feeling? And keeping this internal awareness turned on. This is most important. This is where it all happens. Let's see. One more thing is coming to mind. Um, that's holding space. Uh, Holding space for someone else when they're in a reactive state is a very beautiful practice. I do this with my partner often. Um, if she is in a moment of reactivity, resistance, um, sometimes it's aimed at me, sometimes it's not. but if but when it's happening, what's important on my end is acceptance. Okay, uh, she's has some resistance right now, no problem. And then the holding space is sort of like not joining her in it, but also not holding it against her. That's important too. I'm not holding it against her. She's just having her moment of this is fine. There's sort of an invitation of patience and take as much time as you need to settle, to come back. I'm being mindful as well not to fuel the flame, which I used to do. I used to poke the bear, and now I've better at not doing that instead of just giving space. And then, but the beautiful thing is too is it's mutual. If I have a moment where I'm a little grumpy or off centered and not fully just floating in my peace, then she holds space for me, which is really appreciated as well. And because ideally, if one or the other can hold each space for each other, you don't end up with big, uh, catastrophe dramas. It's just one side can cool down and then you can communicate after. But this is important for any kind of relationship between child and parent, between boss and employee, of course, people, anyone we live with, um, even on social media. Like you have someone on social media and they're reacting, you can tell in their comments, they're reacting really intensely. To be able to hold space is not to engage, not to jump in and fight in the battle, which part of us tends to want to do. Uh, just to give space, not react, let the energy calm down, and then you can actually could go back and try to communicate from that calm space. That's really where communication only happens, is if both parties are calm. Because if one is in a disturbed space, we can't really hear things when we're in that state. um, so that's I find that to be a very practical and helpful thing, to take into the everyday life, just holding space for each other. um, I mean, even when I do mentoring sessions, sometimes somebody will show up and they're in a very just frazzled, chaotic space mentally and emotionally. And part of my, you can go say, gift of the mentoring session is just, okay, this is what you're in right now. Okay, no problem. It's even, there isn't even like an energy to try to fix it. It's just, all right, I'll be here with you. I'm here with you. It's okay. Feel what you're feeling. Take as much time as you need. And there's something in that openness that allows for the settling in our own time, which is it's just a beautiful thing. um, I bet most of the news wouldn't be so dramatic if this was common knowledge. Because most of the chaotic stuff we see on the news, all the crazy events, they happen because somebody uh, gets taken over, by the pain body and the ego, and then it collides with somebody else, and then you have the road rage, and you have the shootings, and you have the violence of sorts. Those are very extreme examples, but yeah, it's something I do hope humans and as a whole learn how to do more. Holding space, and then we can also hold space for ourselves. Though interestingly, um, when I find myself in an irritable type of state, a non-peaceful state, there is a sort of inward caring for it. Maybe it might even be me removing myself from a loud room, or a lot of stimulus, just going somewhere quiet for a moment, stepping outside, taking some deep breaths, just a way to kind of care for my own um, inner world, you might say.